Greetings from New York. Thank you for joining me to talk about classic hits. I'm glad we can be together today. I'm sorry that it isn't in person. I'm going to start by saying two things today and about the state of the classic hits format, and I think both of them are true at the same time. Classic hits has taken over the radio dial. It is number one all over the world. It appeals to older listeners who spend more time with radio. Increasingly, it also appeals to younger listeners. This is also true. Owners do not always respect this format. They are always afraid of being too old, and that has been a constant throughout the 40-year history of the format. I think the way people listen to radio and music has changed now. I think that creates new opportunities. I think in the future, we have to worry less about whether we are too old. So I'm going to talk about a new way to look at the classic hits format. I've been fortunate to be involved with the classic hits format for my entire career. I began as a trade journalist writing for the American publication Radio and Records, where I was their first oldies and classic rock editor. I was radio editor of Billboard. Now I write a newsletter about the radio business called Ross on Radio. In Europe, some of you may actually know me through my connection with Valerie Geller. I've contributed to her books, Creating Powerful Radio and Beyond Powerful Radio. That may be how you recognize me. For nearly 20 years, I've been fortunate to work with Edison Research that has allowed me to conduct survey projects and music testing for radio stations around the world. In every format, and particularly some of the world's greatest classic hit stations. WCBS FM in New York, Boom 97.3 in Toronto. I was fortunate to help Bauer put Greatest Hits Radio on FM. I am fortunate to do a lot of work with Bauer in Finland, working on radio nostalgia, but also on their 80s and 90s channels. And it's paid off. It's a great time for the format right now. This is from the website of BRF. You do not have to speak German to realize that. This is a great moment for classic hits in Berlin, in Belgium, in Boston, in Melbourne, Australia. Why is it happening now? We know that the last 5 years have not been a good time for current music. As younger listeners spend less time with youth formats, it's harder for top 40 to break songs. It's harder for songs to reach critical mass. We have fewer consensus hits. This is the song we're most excited about right now. Harry Styles, As It Was, great record, instant hit. We are all very excited if we work with current music to have this record. But one of the reasons this record is a hit is because it sounds like this record. We are fortunate to have a few more new songs now that look like they're going to be real hits, and most of them sound like older records, whether it's 80s new wave or it's the Lizzo record that sounds like 70s disco. It goes without saying that these are difficult times for almost everybody. Listeners are coming to the classic hits format for a boost. Not just nostalgia, not just to remember the good times, because we're drawing listeners who weren't necessarily here to hear these songs the first time around. Right now, we have a lot of current music that expresses the world's anger. We have a recent #1 called ABCDEFU, and It's how a lot of us feel right now. It gives voice to how people feel right now. But the songs of encouragement, Living on a Prayer, Don't Stop Believing, Eye of the Tiger, those songs were also written during recessions and during downtimes for the world. Those are songs of encouragement, and we don't necessarily have anything like that right now. To some extent, classic hits has been helped because older listeners are the ones listening to more radio. But we're also seeing that the younger listeners who still use radio like older music, and that has implications. These are statistics from Nielsen Ratings in America that were compiled by Larry Rosen at Edison Research. He didn't just look at these three formats. Larry looked at every rated format over the last 10 years. Almost every format dependent on new music was down over the last decade. Country, alternative, but especially top 40 and hip hop. The formats that have risen in America are oldies and classic rock. And Larry's theory is that people looking for new music aren't looking to radio for that new music. So the people who are coming to radio, even if they're younger, are people looking for classic hits, looking for older music. So if classic hits are what people want from radio, why do we still see headlines like this? This is a recent headline from an Australian newspaper. It's a radio station owned by ARN. ARN does very well with classic hits in Melbourne, in Sydney. Despite this, when ARN had to sell one of their Brisbane stations, they sold 4KQ. 4KQ is often number one or number two in Brisbane, even doing music on AM radio. Sometimes they have a 10 share, sometimes they have a 9 share. Despite the ratings, 4KQ was the station they sold, and it's going to an all sports format next month. When they had to choose, ARN did not want to keep the station with the older audience, no matter how successful. And that has been the challenge for classic hits since it was oldies. Where you keep taking it away from people, people keep asking for it back. This is the station where I taught myself oldies as a younger listener. WROR in Boston. This version of WROR is long gone now. WROR is also the station where I won my first contest. It was a trivia question. What rock star was born in Pontypridd? I didn't know Pontypridd, but it sounded Welsh, and I was able to figure out that it was Tom Jones. WROR lasted for about 10 years, and then Oldies went away on FM in Boston for a while. In the late 80s, this station, Oldies 103, signed on in Boston. It was the beginning of an incredibly successful period for oldies. They were instantly copied. WODS was a successful radio station for 20 years. In the mid-aughts, oldies hit a hard patch, and radio stations thought, well, maybe it's the name. So they became WODS, not Oldies 103. And it didn't solve anything. They eventually changed the format. When WODS went away, they helped this station become number one. The new WROR, different owner, different frequency. Classic hits can't be stopped. The audience will not let the format die. So why do owners keep trying? Why isn't winning enough? I think we have to be very careful at this moment in radio history about taking radio stations away from people. They have other choices. They will not necessarily default to their second favorite radio station. They may not have a second favorite radio station. Their second favorite radio station may be streaming. Even when classic hits or classic rock stations are winning, they always have to contend with the prospect of the demographic cliff. There is always concern about the age of the audience. In America, radio has never learned to make money with listeners over age 50. In Europe, I think broadcasters do a much better job of it. I have worked with stations in Europe that are proudly targeting listeners up to the age of 70. But because we are so concerned about the age of the audience, especially in North America, we are always pushing the format forward in terms of the music it plays and no longer plays. So, up until now, this is how we've decided what to play. We have always targeted the format based on what we think our current listeners or the listeners we want to be our current listeners were listening to in high school. That is the music people are supposed to be most loyal to. This is how the format it has evolved in America. It is still based mostly around the 80s, but it's another 10 years, and programmers are trying to figure out how they go into the 90s. Do they play the Backstreet Boys? Do they play Britney Spears? Some stations are starting to play Lady Gaga as an oldie. When we add newer music, we typically drop older music, and sometimes it's arbitrary. Let's not play the 60s. Let's not play the 70s. A few years ago, some stations were phasing out Fleetwood Mac, and then Dreams went viral. And since we do see older songs going viral, I think it's time to throw out the slide rule. I think the calculation is not going to be as simple anymore. I think this is a time when everybody likes everything. So, welcome to the classic hits multiverse. Those crazy kids and their TikTok videos, they don't just know Footloose and Fleetwood Mac. Somehow they also know Love Grows Where My Rosemary Goes. I'm not sure if that's a good thing. I don't know if I want to hear Edison Lighthouse again, but it certainly changes the way we think about the format. Of course, classic hits is still going to be a format that mostly targets 40-year-olds. Of course, it is still going to play music mostly from the time that listener was in high school. There won't be a lot of outliers, but there will be some, and I think we can be less strict about era. Some songs are going to be all-time greats now, and they're going to be all-time greats in 10 years. People still like Fleetwood Mac, even though it's from 1967. People still like Respect by Aretha Franklin or Brown Eyed Girl, even though they're from 1967. And they might even continue to like them for the next 10 years. You could usually count on listeners only knowing the songs that they had grown up with that had been top 10 hits. If a song hadn't gotten to power rotation, if a song hadn't gone to recurrent, if a song hadn't been in the library for 20 years, chances are they didn't know it. Now songs come back into circulation all the time. Should we be playing Love Grows Where My Rosemary Goes? I'm a researcher. It's easy for me to answer that question. Ask the audience. Let them tell you what's still important, but make sure that you're asking about those songs. Not every oldie that's in a movie is going to take hold, but some do. Not every song in a TikTok video is going to become a radio song. Not every song on a talent competition, but some will. We should always be looking to research those songs and see what takes hold. To some extent, we are already doing this, and we don't even realize it. We are less connected to a traditional timeline than before. It's true that most of the listeners we want to target didn't grow up with the Beatles. They don't remember the Beatles as an active group. But they don't remember Bryan Adams having hits either. If you're 35, Summer of 69 is older than you are. If you're 40, Eye of the Tiger is as old as you are, and I Love Rock and Roll is 2 years before your time. Chances are you don't mind too much. Chances are you like all of the songs that you hear at weddings and at parties and at clubs equally. Chances are, if you're 35 or 40, you do not say, I like Bon Jovi, but the Beatles are too old, because you don't remember either of them. 35-year-olds did watch the Beatles get back. 35-year-olds do not necessarily say, I wanted to watch this special on TV, but I do not want to hear these songs on the radio. If they're interested, they're interested. Harry Styles is 28. Harry Styles probably watched Get Back. With time, I think we're going to see stations that play an older version of oldies for the people who were there at the time and a newer version of classic hits with songs that everybody knows. To some extent, in the UK, we're already seeing that with the new Boom Radio, which plays music going back to even before rock and roll. These are two stations from Phoenix, Arizona. One plays music from the 70s, 80s, and 90s. One plays music from the 60s and 70s. At this moment, the older leading station, the Wow Factor, is actually winning at least 6+. In Europe, I think we'll see side formats and older formats handled more through digitals and through streaming side channels. But I think we will also see situations like we see in Finland, where the same owner has Radio Nostalgia plus an 80s channel plus a 90s based channel. There are a couple of other things that I'd like to talk to you about that are starting to happen with the classic hits format in America that you might be following or find interesting. In America, we're seeing stations that treat the music as top 40. They play their big songs, Every Breath You Take, Billie Jean, 4 or 5 times a day. KEarth 101 in Los Angeles is very successful doing this. They have been the #1 station in Los Angeles for much of the last 2 years. But not everybody following that model does as well as KEarth. If you look at this slide, this is based on every rated American classic hit station in the top 50 markets. And the stations that do best are still the stations that play songs once or twice a day. One of the things I would want people to take from this presentation, rather than copying any radio station, is that there is no one right way to do classic hits. In general, I worry about stations losing their individualism. One of the best things radio can do when people need radio so much right now is to sound like their markets. I've worked with a lot of classic hit stations. I have seen all sorts of classic hit stations do well. Some play 200 songs, some play 500 songs, some play their songs 25 times a week. I work with a 10-share radio station that plays its hits about 7 or 8 times a week. One of the things I'm proudest of in my career is helping stations achieve unique solutions. When I have made a mistake as a consultant or a researcher, it's usually been in trying to recreate the specific success of another radio station, trying to take something that works in one market and apply it to another. One of my final messages for you today is to be proud of the format. I think we need to be proud of the format since sometimes people in the industry have an inferiority complex about it. We should make sure that when we turn on a classic hit station, it conveys the fun and excitement of being classic hits. It shouldn't sound like the adult contemporary station down the hall. It's easy because we share a lot of the same records, but we need to have the excitement. And chances are, if your adult contemporary station down the hall is still playing Moonlight Shadow or Words Don't Come Easy, perhaps it's time for them to move on for those records. This is fun, exciting music that people heard on fun, exciting radio stations. We don't want to live in the past, but if we don't carry the energy forward with us, we are only doing half the job. People who grew up with these records remember them in a fun, energetic context. People who didn't grow up with these records are coming from top 40 and they remember radio as being fun and energetic. I wanted to leave people with a story about a very small market radio station in America. This is a station that has a cult following. Maybe you've heard of it. If not, you'll really enjoy listening to it. It's a small town radio station in an American resort market, Eastern Long Island. They are classic hits, but really they're the local full service radio station for their market. They still do news every hour. They still do lost dog reports and classifieds and obituaries and all the hallmarks of small town radio. They probably play some songs you've never heard of. This is an hour, and I hadn't heard of every song on this list. But this is a very specific hour. Recently, Brian Bannon, after about 30 years on this station, left to work for public radio. The next day, even after he was out of the building, listeners called the All Request Show and dedicated song after song to him. It's the end of the world, the final countdown. I dedicated on the radio. Even though he was gone, he still resonated with listeners. And this whole episode, I think, is a reminder of our power with listeners and why we can be proud to be classic hits. Here are a few more takeaways. The stronger our classic hit stations are, the stronger they are as a magnet for all of radio. Classic hits is something people want from radio now. We're trying to figure out what people want from radio. We know they want classic hits. We know that they bring people to the dial. I think we could probably be on our classic hit stations reminding people to listen to our top 40 stations the next time they want new music. I have talked mostly about music here, but I do think that personality is something that people want from radio now, personality and companionship, and that keeps us from being just a playlist. Above all, classic hits isn't old. We need not to think of it that way, and we need to not let our owners think of it that way. Classic hits is classic radio. It's the best of what we do. It can continue to grow and evolve and constantly renew. I'd like to thank you for listening this morning. There are always a lot of great speakers at Radio Days Europe. You came here to interact with them. I hope that we will get the opportunity to interact as well. And here's how.
Okay, I hope you got his Twitter handles. They're in the bio on the Swapcard app if you need them. That was a great presentation, albeit a virtual one. Sean was good enough to answer some questions that had been put through the Radiodays social media channels. So he was good enough to record the answers to them. So we might play those for a few minutes before we bring the session to an end.
What's my favorite classic hits or oldies success story? I can think of two. I've enjoyed every project I've worked on. Every project teaches me something about the next one. But there are a couple. One is in the late 2000s, I helped put the classic hits format on FM in Canada for the first time, the first station to play classic hits on FM in Canada is XL 103 in Calgary. They are still very successful. I'm still happy to be involved with them. And I'm proud of having brought the format to FM there. I'm proud of having helped bring the format to FM in the UK. I wondered if London would ever have the classic hits format on FM, and I'm happy to see that it does now. One of the other stations that made me the happiest to work with a couple of years ago was WOGL in Philadelphia. WOGL still plays, or until recently still played, the theme from Rocky because it's Philadelphia. They were a unique station, and at a time when they weren't sure what direction the format should take, did very well for a couple of years. And recently they have rebranded, but I think it brought them probably 5 successful years as WOGL. What is the best way to ask the audience what they want? I think it's to just always be conscious of what they might want now. And some of it is, we're testing the 90s now. Maybe it's time to test This Is How We Do It by Montel Jordan. Maybe it's time to start testing the Spice Girls again. But it's also keeping track of when songs pop into listeners' consciousness. And of course, that used to happen a couple of times a year. Now, thanks to TikTok and viral video and streaming, it happens a couple of times a week. So, for those stations that are still capable of doing testing on a regular basis, don't just look at what other stations are playing. You may be looking at the results of their music testing. You may be looking at the results of them looking at other stations and guessing. The best thing to do is think about what's in pop culture now. Think about what might have changed. Think about what you're hearing around you now that you might not have heard. In Europe, radio stations have always played Jolene by Dolly Parton. In North America, people never thought of it as a pop record. People thought of it as a country record. The country had its own oldie stations, and nobody would have thought that Jolene was in pop culture. But of course, Dolly Parton was at the apex of her superstardom again. Of course, it was on every singing competition. Of course, Miley Cyrus was sampling it or covering it. And when you finally get North American program directors to be willing to put Jolene in music research, of course it comes back, even though most people are not old enough to remember it when it was new. So, what songs have come back into mass consciousness recently? It's rarely songs that come from out of the blue. If you talk to your teenagers, they'll know songs, even older songs that you don't know. They'll know songs that surprise you. Most of what they know will be the songs we're already playing on the radio, but there'll be one or two surprises. One of the songs I've heard about in pop culture, and I'm just starting to test it now to see if this translates to the radio, is Billy Joel Vienna. It's been an album cut from a big album for more than 40 years, but it's not something that we thought of as a major Billy Joel song. But somehow I hear people talking about it more. I see it on more playlists. I hear people talk about it as an example of a Billy Joel song they know and like, even again, if they weren't around for The Stranger or Glass Houses or 52nd Street as current albums. So, how has the ideal classic hits program director changed? How has the ideal radio product manager changed? We've talked a lot about how program managers shouldn't be entirely focused on music, how they should be salespeople, how they should be promotional people, how they should be creators of viral video. And all of these things are true, but with this format, as much as any other, the music is job one. The music is the magnet. Putting it in a great package that makes you more than just a playlist is important. Starting with the right music to begin with is important too. Sitting there at your music software and deciding what sounds good to next to this other song still matters. We spend a lot of time talking about people making mixtapes and playlists for each other. You are creating a playlist for listeners every day. You are creating a 24-hour playlist for listeners every day. And all the things that go into making a great radio station embellish that playlist, but it all starts with the playlist. Why are owners sometimes seemingly embarrassed about the classic hits format? Is it just because they feel like they can't sell to an older audience? Sometimes I think it goes further than that. Sometimes I think people feel like to move into oldies, whether you're a program director, whether you're a manager, whether you're a DJ, a presenter, sometimes you feel like you're planning for your own retirement. And I don't think you should feel that way. I think you should look at peers, but also people who are 10 years younger than you, people who are 25 years younger than you. Your kids are not embarrassed about liking music from the 70s and 80s. Why should you be? At this moment, this is the thing we know that people want from radio. We're still trying to figure out what they want from us in terms of new music and recent music. And when new music and recent music make a comeback, it doesn't mean that they won't want the songs they have accumulated over the course of the last couple of years, because we are in the everybody listens to everything era. And it is certainly possible that some 18-year-old may discover something they like in current music and come back to current music at the center, but that hasn't happened yet. And I wouldn't count on it necessarily happening that way. I would count on that person liking old music and new music together going forward. How often should oldies or classic hit stations refresh their music? Some people like to platoon songs in and out of the library every couple of months. If your competition isn't going to stop playing Take On Me for a couple of weeks. I don't know that it helps you much to stop playing Take On Me. Either people are sick of that song or they're not sick of it. Generally, classic hit stations change their music only when they do a music test. If they're lucky, that's once a year. If they're really lucky, that's twice a year. At this point, because of COVID and because of radio station budgets, it may be every couple of years. I think the hits are the hits. I think listeners do want some surprises. I think the fact that a song like Love Grows Where My Rosemary Goes comes back through TikTok, I think that gives you an opportunity to surprise people. But I think you should be trying to surprise people with songs that are your own enterprise. I think if you are playing enough of the hits, that you have room to surprise people. I always encourage people to play hits plus, play enough variety that people don't get sick of the hits, play enough hits that people don't hear the variety and go, what is this doing here? If you play enough hits and then you play variety, people will know that you're doing it for a reason, especially if you use sweepers or stagers to tell them that you're doing it for a reason. Should personalities come from the era of the music they're playing? Not necessarily. I think you are looking for people who are creative. I think you are looking for people who provide companionship. I think you are looking for people who know and can speak authoritatively about the music, but that doesn't mean trivia. That doesn't mean nostalgia. That doesn't mean remember when. But I think you've got to sound like you've heard of these records. I hear a lot of younger presenters on classic hit stations who do not sound like they've heard of the records. I hear a lot of presenters on classic hit stations who sound like they looked the songs up on Wikipedia. I don't need somebody to read Wikipedia to me. I need somebody to relate to the music. And that doesn't have to be remember when this was on the charts. That could be telling the story of the song and how it relates to them. That could be telling the story of the song in some creative way that relates it to your own life. It could be talking about where an artist is touring if they're still touring. It should not be, can you believe that this artist is 75? It should not be, can you believe that this song is actually 40 years old? That's not what people are coming for. People don't need your help to tell them that. So, what is my dream presenter presenting my dream song? Honestly, it's anybody who surprises me and anybody who says something that surprises me, anybody who says something that I'd want to repeat. Maybe it's a song I haven't heard on the radio in a while. Maybe it's girls just want to have fun and you have something to say about it that makes me think about that song in a different way, even though I heard it yesterday and the day before. In general, what I am looking for from presenters, I am looking for companionship. I am looking for energy. If I don't have energy, I need it from you. If I do have energy, I want you to reflect it and enhance it. I want sense of place, especially if I'm streaming your station from halfway around the world. If I'm listening to my local station, I need to know what's going on here. But if I'm listening to your station halfway around the world, you're my pen pal, and I'm counting on you to tell me what's happening in your town and not sound like you could be coming from anywhere.